Welcome into the top 10 most aggressive chess openings. Some of these openings are real killers that give you significant odds of winning early in the game. And let's start off with the opening line, which is really loved by the Magnus Carlsen. He plays it in his Blitz games frequently, and let us take a look. It starts with knight c3, kind of Vienna game, but after that white goes pawn to f4, using somewhat similar to the King's Gambit. And after black captures the pawn, you go pawn to d4. As a result of this pawn sacrifice, white got this beautiful pawn center, which is ready to go forward anytime you want and potentially start attacking black. Also, you're ready to take back that pawn on f4, and so far everything looks just great for white. But of course, there is one major question. What if black plays queen h4, delivering check to your king? Because then it forces white to move his king forward, king to e2, which looks really awkward, and usually that's not something that you love doing. To activate your king in an early stage of the game is really usually a really bad idea. But in this particular case, it gives you great position. Let's take a look. Let's say black goes pawn to d6 because, what else can they do? It's not that easy for black to figure out how to take advantage of the white's exposed king position. And by playing pawn to d6, black is preparing bishop g4 check, attacking potentially the king and the queen. Definitely makes sense. White goes knight to f3, which also attacks the black's queen on h4. And if the queen just retreats somewhere, white would gladly capture the pawn on f4 back, and he's really great. Therefore, black would probably play bishop to g4. And after this, you can play one more provocative move, which is bishop takes f4. You're taking that gambit pawn back, but I'm saying that it's a really provocative move because here black can capture that knight on f3, and if you want to save that bishop on f4, you're forced to recapture by the king, which puts your king in a seemingly truly exposed position. Now it is on the third rank. While most of your pieces are still on the first rank, you are kind of developing your king instead of the knight. Like usually white would place the knight on this square on f3, but in this case it is the king that goes there. And so it looks really risky at first, but in reality, white's getting a great position. And let me show you how it works out in real games. Now let's see how it works out in real practical games. Here you can see the statistics of the moves played in the game database. You see the first most played move is pawn to e4. One of the top two replies is pawn to e5. Then you go knight to c3. Black most likely will respond knight to c6. You go pawn to f4. By far the most common reply is pawn takes. Then instead of knight to f3, you go pawn to d4. And as you can see, this line is a lot less known. But after that, black are likely to give you the check. You go king e2. And then the cool thing about this is that, as you can see, we're going on the main line here. So black are most likely to play the moves which we are talking about. And at this point, you play pawn to g3, king, queen to g4. And here, if you play the correct move, king to g2, as you can see, it gives you 73% chance of winning, meaning white won 73% of games. And if you look at the players, like for example here you can see the Dr. Nichterstein, who is Magnus Carlsen, and since the guy knows a thing or two about chess, we can probably trust his recommendation. And at this point you can see the whole point of the white's idea. White's king got back to safety, and white still has these beautiful pawns in the center. White's got two bishops. The bishops are ready to go forward, like bishop can go to b5, pawns are ready to go forward and chase the black's knights if necessary. So everything is just great for white. Black certainly cannot attack anymore. Most likely it will actually transpose into an endgame, which is favorable for white. If black insists on trying to keep the queens on the board and plays queen at g6, this will rather backfire. You can continue with bishop d3, and now you're threatening pawn to e5, attacking you with your bishop over the opponent's queen. And as you can see here, white is winning the vast majority of games. So therefore, this opening line is definitely one of the cool ones for you to play, and it gives you great attacking winning chances. By the way, guys, let me know if you enjoy these kind of opening lessons with attacking openings, because in the past, I used to record a lot of openings where I share the tricks, opening tricks, but here is just an attacking opening. And if you love this subject, also like this video, and if it gets to 1000 likes, I'll know that you guys love that, and I will be recording my continuations with more attacking openings for you. There we go with the number 9 in our list of the most aggressive chess openings, Urusov Gambit. Here we go, bishop to c4, and after knight f6, pawn to d4. instead of playing more common moves such as pawn to d3 or knight to c3, you go in the most aggressive direction, pawn to d4, putting some pressure on black right away. They are most likely to capture the pawn, and here, instead of recapturing the pawn with your queen, which is something I would not recommend you to do, because in this case black can go knight to c6 and gain a tempo by attacking your queen. Here black is doing perfectly well. Therefore, instead of recapturing the pawn immediately, you can go knight to f3, just continuing your development and offering black an opportunity to capture one more pawn on the e4. And if black is greedy and captures that pawn, then after queen takes d4, you get a really powerful attacking position. And I would say that in a practical game, black is already somewhat in trouble. It's not that his position is bad, but it's just fairly difficult for black to figure out the right defensive moves at this point already. For example, if they go knight to d6, which is something that we're going to analyze. Okay, let me first show you knight to f6, because black needs to retreat with their knight somewhere. Then you just continue with knight to c3, and let's say queen d3, and then you go bishop g5. For example, black goes some bishop b4, you go bishop g5, and after that you will probably castle long side, and you have pretty strong attacking position. If black goes queen e7 check, you can just go king to f1, and then pressure black with rook to e1, knight is coming to d5. Again, of course, the game goes on, but as you can see, you clearly have here very good attacking chances. Now let's take a few moves back. We just have analyzed black retreating with their knight to f6, and now let's take a look at knight goes to d6, which also seems like making sense for black, because they're trying to also attack your bishop, but you can ignore that and just castle. And now, in light of the rook e1 threat, with a very straightforward attack over the opponent's king, black is actually already losing, even though it's only the 6th move of the game, but black is already lost. Isn't it cool? I do think so. If black goes, let's say, knight c6, you just continue with rook to e1 check, and now black realizes that they cannot cover the king by the bishop, because in this case, you would just gladly grab the pawn on g7, attacking the rook as well, and black is done here. Therefore, they would have to play the awkward move knight to e7. And then you can simply play bishop b3 to save your bishop. And now, regardless of what black does, they're probably going to be losing very quickly. If they try to go knight d to f5, trying to somehow, push your queen away and then hoping to play pawn to d5 and finalizing their development, you can actually go forward, queen to d5. Taking advantage of the pin over the e-file, therefore black cannot capture your queen, and now on the next move you're preparing this color's mate on the f7 square. If black plays something, you can just capture that pawn and it is checkmate. So that definitely does not help black. Let's take a few moves back, and at this point let's say they'll do something else. For example, pawn to b6, trying to develop their bishop over the b7 square. Then you go knight to g5, take an aim at that f7 square, and if they continue bishop to b7, you can think about this for a second and try to find the winning continuation for white here. And if you can't find it, feel free to write it down in the comments below. The next one is Danish Gambit, which happens after the first moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, pawn to d4. Here white starts sacrificing pawns in order to obtain quick development and advantage in activity. And if black keeps capturing the pawns, at this point you can already see the white's idea. White has these two bishops pointing towards black's territory and the extra pawn in the center. Therefore, black already should be super careful, and even one inaccurate move for black could lead to an immediate disaster. Let's say black would play a bishop to b4, just trying to develop their pieces with a tempo. You go knight to c3, knight to f6, knight to e2. And at this point, black may decide to capture one more pawn of yours, thinking that you just overlooked that the knight is pinned. And if they capture this pawn, if you can seduce them into doing that, then they're actually in a big trouble. You can just castle. Now the black's knight is attacked, therefore they'll probably trade it off. And at this point, black will realize that they're greatly underdeveloped, and you have just way too many threats for black to handle. But the most significant threat is rook to e1, attacking the king right away, therefore they'll probably castle. Now you jump with your knight to d5, attacking the bishop on b4, and if bishop goes back somewhere, does it really matter? Let's say bishop to c5, Now you actually have a few winning continuations, and one of them, which just looks nice to me, is knight to f6 check. You're sacrificing the knight in order to open up the position around the black's king, and after black captures the knight, you go queen to g4 check, king h8 is forced, now queen h4, threatening bishop takes f6, which is also supported by your queen. Therefore, black can only protect it by playing bishop to e7, and now you switch the angle of your attack by playing bishop to d3, preparing queen takes h7 checkmate, and there is nothing black can do about this because the f pawn is pinned by your bishop, and therefore we can say that the original idea of the Danish Gambit to get these two super strong attacking pieces worked out really well in this line. Now, of course, black does not have to play that badly, and there are plenty of the other options that black can choose. And in case you wonder, like, what... And for the next opening killer, I'm switching over to the game database just to show you that, once again, you are destined to win if you just follow this recommendation. Alright, so the first most played move, as you can see here, is pawn to e4, and if you go pawn to e5 and you go into the Rilo pass, one of the most common chess openings, and then at this point you can go pawn to f5, known as Schliemann variation. And here's the magic. Now let's take a look at the most common replies of white. It is pawn to d3, because most players are unaware of the following fairly complicated theoretical lines, and therefore they prefer to play safe and just to protect the pawn. And now you go into the main line, so you trade the pawns, you go knight to f6, and the good thing for black here is that you opened up that f file, which is going to be used for your rook in the future after you castle. Anyway, let's keep going over the main line. Castle, bishop to c5, knight to c3, d6. So far, both players are just developing their pieces. And why go knight to d5? You know, a lot of the players, they'll truly love to take advantage of this pin and jump with their knight to d5. But in this particular case, it's totally not dangerous for you. In a way, it even helps you, because you can go king to h8, asking white to capture. Once again, we're going over the main line, all right? Pawn recapture, bishop h6, rook to g8, and at this point you can see what was the black's intention. Even though white seemingly disrupted the pawn structure around your king, but in fact your king is doing perfectly safe standing there in the corner, and now your rook has an open file aiming towards the white's king. And all of a sudden white is actually in trouble now, because, you know, the black's rook is really active, your bishop from c8 is ready to go to h3 or g4, putting even more pressure onto the white's position. And all in all, as you can see that here, statistically, black is actually most likely to win. More games are won by black, not by white, which is a rare case in the chess openings, because usually, because white starts the game, they should be having better chances. But in this opening, that's not the case. You are having actually better chances of winning. That's really cool. Again, of course, white can save the game, but you have really strong attacking position, and you have the straightforward plan of attacking the white's king. There we go with the next one. After you already crushed your opponent with in the main lines, which we have just analyzed, your opponent may decide, okay, let me at least go away from his opening preparation. Instead of the main move knight to c6, I'll play knight to f6, known as Petrov's defense, and it is definitely a less played move. But in this case, you also have an aggressive opening prepared, and therefore your opponent will just realize that they have no chance and will probably quit chess or something like that. Alright, so if they go pawn to d6, the main line for white is going back knight to f3, but since we're talking about the most aggressive openings, you're gonna play knight takes f7, known as a Englund Gambit. Here you got two pawns for a knight, plus you're exposing the black's king, and you continue with pawn to d4, therefore you're just getting this nice compensation for sacrificed material in the form of beautiful pawn center. Your bishop is ready to go to c4 potentially to attack the black's king, and generally black lost their right to castle, therefore the weak king will be a long-term problem for black. Now, what can black possibly play here? If they decide to grab your pawn on e4, maybe they just thought that you overlooked this pawn, then you go queen to h5 check, and this is actually bad for black, because from here queen is also threatening queen d5 potentially on the next move to attack both the king and the knight, and therefore black can't play, let's say, g6, right? Then you just go queen to d5 and you'll get back your knight on the next move while saving a more attacking position. And if they try king to e7, let's say, then you go queen to e2, attacking the knight, And if black protects it somehow, then you go bishop g5. You're taking advantage of the pin, and now you are winning the queen because of the attack of your bishop. Alright, we've got a few more aggressive openings to cover, and there we go with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and here after you go into the 4 knights game, here instead you transpose it into the Belgrade Gambit. At this point, instead of recapturing the pawn knight takes d4, you play the gambit line knight goes forward to d5, putting some pressure on black's position right away. Now we can notice that if black captures that knight on d5 immediately, then after you capture, you force the black's knight to go back, and they might not like that thing, and of course in the next move you can take that pawn back, therefore that doesn't look that great for black. And they instead may decide to capture your pawn on e4 because it looks like there is no danger, and why not to do that? But here you just continue with bishop to c4, and even though there are no super strong threats that you created so far, but obviously you have this initiative position, and one of the problems black may experience is the weakness of the knight on e4, and potentially along the e-file after you play queen to e2, for example, you may start questioning that knight on e4. Therefore, sometimes black decides to solve that problem right away and just retreat with the knight back to c5, and from here the knight is also ready to jump back to e6 to cover like literally the entire black's position. But in this case you can win the game right away by playing bishop to g5, attacking the queen, therefore they'll probably play pawn to f6, but now instead of retreating with your bishop you can just go knight to h4. Very common tactical motif, by the way, where you go with your knight to h4, enabling your queen to go there on h5 and attack the opponent's king. It actually works in different opening lines, and in this case as well, it just helps white to win immediately. For example, after pawn takes, queen to h5 check, the only way to cover the king is pawn to g6, but it doesn't really help because you can capture that pawn, and now the next move, for example, pawn takes, queen takes g6, checkmate. So far we talked a lot about the e4, e5 opening, but another very common move is pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. And here there is yet another killer. Once again, there is the opening line that literally helps you to win, most likely, because if your opponent plays the most played move, played by the first line, you are winning, which is really funny. Actually, here after knight f3, knight to c6, you can go pawn to b4, which is a very unusual sacrifice. I mean, it's kind of common to sacrifice the pawn there on the previous move, but not right here, because it really looks like it makes no sense. Black can capture the pawn either with their pawn or with the knight, and it's totally unclear why would you just give away the pawn for nothing, right? In fact, this is an old gambit. It's been known for, I think, a long time, but in fact, nobody really paid much attention to it because it just looked totally weird. And then, I think around 10 years ago actually, I recorded a video covering this line, and since then it gained in popularity, but still a lot of players are unaware of this line, and therefore you really have a good chance to win. I'll just show you one line here. For example, they recapture by the pawn or by the knight, leads to the same thing. You go pawn to d4, getting this pawn center, threatening pawn to d5 to kick away the knight, and if they go pawn to d5, then you capture, and then you gain one more tempo by playing pawn to c4. And here, if they take en passant, you recapture by the knight, attacking the queen by once again. You're always keep attacking your opponent. And if they go queen a5, you can play bishop d2 to protect your knight, or you can keep playing in that super aggressive style and just play pawn to d5. You don't want to defend, you want to counter attack. And after they capture the knight, you play bishop d2, attacking the queen. Queen goes away somewhere, you capture the knight back. And after recapturing with a pawn, you can go rook to c1 to just put some pressure onto black's position. Potentially the rook has taken aim at that pawn on c6. And here, even though black again is not losing, but definitely you can see that white is a lot more active. They already activated lots of their pieces, while black were mainly just running around with their queen, and most of their pieces are still on their initial position. Therefore, definitely have great attacking position here. And again, I'm not showing you the database here, but you can just trust me that in the most games, black are doing exactly this. They're playing bishop d7 here, or you go bishop c4, simply continuing your development. And I'm still showing you the first line actually, and here black is already lost. All right, so you go bishop c3, attacking the queen, knight to e5, and this time attacking the bishop on d7, And let's say rook d8, you go bishop d3, you keep attacking on every move. Of course, you know, we cannot really cover every opening possibility here, but you can just get the general idea that white is ahead in development, they can keep attacking however they want, and because black is underdeveloped, it's really hard for them. You can go bishop a5 now, taking the rook, and once it goes away, you can even finish the game in a beautiful way by playing bishop g6, threatening either checkmate after queen takes d7 or bishop takes f7. Once again, yet another killer. Take it, use it, and enjoy it. Here's one more. We've got a few more to cover, and the last one is actually yet another killer, but we cannot avoid talking about King's Gambit if we talk about attacking chess openings, because certainly that's definitely should be in the list. It's one of the most aggressive chess openings. Now, you sacrifice the pawn for quick development to get also control in the center. If black go pawn to g5, which is one of the main lines, you can continue here playing pawn to h4 to keep pressuring black. And after pawn to g4 and knight to g5, this knight has no way back, and therefore it is doomed to be sacrificed. For example, if black decides to attack it right away, you can sacrifice an f7. Now, of course, you're a piece down, but the problem for black is that exposed king. And now you can continue with pawn to d4. You are ready to develop your bishop, you're ready to take this pawn back or to take that pawn back on g4, and you're just continuing your development. And if black goes something like pawn to d5, you can take that pawn at 4. It's actually the game played by Tarash, one of the famous chess players of the past. He was one of the strongest chess players at the time, around 100 years ago actually, but anyway. And here in one of his games, that's what happened. As you can see, white's clearly ahead in development. And after knight f6, he played bishop e5, attacking the knight. Black covered the knight, and it seems like he's actually doing well. It seems like he's really solidifying his position with these pieces, but white found a tricky combination. He took the bishop first, and after king takes, he played a very interesting move. Instead of going queen to f1 right away, which would allow the black's king to, run back, he played bishop to f7 to, eliminate the possibility for black's king to go back. And since the king is cut it off, now it's all over. He played pawn e3, and white finalized the game with queen to f1 and queen to f4 checkmate. Really beautiful game, and one another really aggressive opening of white. And now we've got the final two crushing openings. First of all, let's take a look at one more line which you can use in the King's Gambit, because once again, definitely King's Gambit is one of the most aggressive ones out there. Here we just analyze the move pawn to h4, but another way to go about this is to play bishop to c4, which is also definitely in style of King's Gambit, because basically your idea is to open up this f-file, which can be used by your rook, and then together with the bishop you can take aim at the weakest point of the black's position, that f7 pawn, hoping to checkmate the opponent's king somewhere soon. If black goes pawn to g4 to attack your knight, it looks like white is in some sort of trouble, because if knight goes away, black can play queen h4 to attack your king, but you're not gonna retreat or defend, you're gonna just sacrifice it and play castle. Here in this game, black played queen to e7, just they realized that their f7 square is weak, and instead of being greedy and taking the knight, they decided to cover their weakness. But white player played knight to c3 anyway. It was played by Zuckertord, one of the famous players of the past. Here the knight aims to jump to d5, and black realized that sooner or later they'll have to take that knight anyway, so they took it, and white played pawn to d4. Another common idea for white, they're not afraid for black taking that pawn on g2, because your opponent cannot checkmate you with a pawn, usually, in the vast majority of the cases. And in this case, it would only help white to bring their rook into play, and now we can clearly see the idea of the King's Gambit in a very clear way. You're gonna checkmate the opponent's king probably pretty soon. In the real game, black did not take that pawn on g2 correctly. They played pawn to d6, trying to develop some pieces. White played knight to d5, attacking the queen, and then queen takes f3. Black played knight to c6 and queen takes f4. Once again, white is trying to use their pieces to concentrate them against the f7 square. Black played knight to d8 to cover it, and now white played queen to g3, and black probably overlooked the idea of white. He played pawn to f6, still trying to somehow cover the f line, but white prepared this time another trick. Can you find it? You can think about this for a few seconds. It is queen takes g8 sacrifice, and now after black recaptures, white takes knight at f6 check, king e7 is forced, and now white can take the rook firstly with the check, king e8 is forced, and its knight goes back. It really becomes super powerful piece, and after king to e7, white captured the bishop and played bishop g5, and black just resigned because he was devastated. And the final opening that I'd like to share with you today is another killer. After pawn to e4, pawn to c5, sit-and defense, there is a move which totally wins the game right away. Black has no chance, and it is pawn to a3. Yeah, I know it sounds silly, but this game on a practical level, funnily enough, kind of wins the game really, because according to the statistics, black are most likely to lose, which is absolutely crazy, and yet it's true. I actually covered this line in one of my previous videos, and you may wish to go there and check this out. So here I'll just show you one line which will illustrate the idea of this gambit line. So you're eventually preparing pawn to b4, black goes knight to c6, thinking that they stopped you, but you go there anyway, and after black's accepted the pawn sacrifice, you now play pawn to c3, pawn to d4, gaining this beautiful pawn center, and it's ready to go forward d5, changing the knight. So black are usually going pawn to d5, and after you recapture and play knight to a3, all of a sudden black's position becomes significantly dangerous, and your main threat is to go knight to b5 and then knight to c7, attacking a whole bunch of black's pieces. And here again, in the vast majority of the games, black go knight f6, which is losing. Again, you can take a look at my video where I covered those lines. And let me here show you just one more line. If black goes pawn to e5, which is another common move of black, you still go knight to b5, threatening knight c7 with a triple attack over the black's heavy pieces and the king. And if black go queen d8 to cover that square, then you push the pawn forward d5, attacking the knight, and then you keep pushing it to d6 to lock the black's pieces away and also to prepare knight to c7. And if black go knight a6 to cover that square, then you temporarily sacrifice the rook, and after that you go knight c7 check, and you grab the rook back. Now white is a piece up, black's king is weak, and it's time for black to resign.